Ever since I can remember, the idea of owning my own house seemed like the greatest adventure in the world. I grew up in Ohio, in a small, aging home that always seemed to need something fixed. The pipes clanged in the winter. The roof leaked in the spring, and the windows rattled every time there was a storm. My mother, Linda, did her best with what we had, but money was always tight. Even as a little girl, I could feel the weight of those financial worries in the air, lingering between every conversation and decision. Sometimes I would walk alone through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, staring at the old Victorian houses with their tidy gardens and big porches. I'd imagine myself someday standing on my porch, holding a mug of coffee, watching the sunrise over a lawn that belonged just to me. As soon as I was old enough, I started saving. I took on every job I could find. At 16, I worked evenings and weekends at Maple Diner, pouring endless cups of coffee and learning to carry heavy trays with a steady hand. I also tutored local kids in math, helped an elderly neighbor organize her attic, and even walked dogs for half the families on our block. There were times when I was so tired I could hardly stand, but each paycheck felt like a tiny brick laid in the foundation of my future. My friends at school sometimes teased me for being so focused, for never joining them on spontaneous trips, or for missing out on parties, but I was determined. I didn't care about the latest shoes or fancy dinners. I watched classmates go on family vacations to Europe or New York, posting photos in front of famous landmarks. But all I could think about was my savings account and how each dollar got me closer to my dream. By the time I finished high school, I had managed to save almost $5,000. It wasn't much, but it felt monumental to me. I kept working all through college, juggling classes and jobs. While other students partied or traveled during summer break, I stuck around Columbus, sometimes picking up double shifts at a bookstore or babysitting for a couple who lived in a brand new development out by the highway. It felt a little lonely sometimes, watching people come and go, but I always reminded myself that every sacrifice was worth it. My dream was waiting for me, just out of reach, but getting closer each year. After I graduated, I took a job at a local accounting firm. The hours were long and the work was sometimes tedious, but the pay was decent. I still lived at home, paying my share of the bills and helping my mother out whenever I could, but I continued to put away every spare dollar. I opened a special savings account and made it a rule never to touch the money unless it was absolutely necessary. Over the years, I watched my friends get married, buy cars, and start families. Some of them even bought houses with their partners, but I stayed focused on my goal. I wanted to do it all on my own with money I had earned myself. It took almost 10 years for my savings to reach $120,000. I checked my bank account almost obsessively, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day, just to see the numbers. It wasn't a fortune, not compared to the mansions I used to dream about as a child, but it was everything to me. I started looking at land for sale just outside Columbus. I wanted a place with space for a little garden, maybe a spot for a hammock between 2 trees. Somewhere peaceful but not too far from work or family. Every evening I'd scroll through listings, comparing prices and making careful notes. I imagined what kind of house I'd build, a cozy 2-bedroom with a wide front porch and lots of windows for sunlight, maybe a fireplace for cold Ohio winters. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was on the verge of something extraordinary, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff about to take a leap of faith. But then, just as I was about to start making calls to builders, my mother stepped in. Linda has always been a force in our family, stubborn and opinionated, sometimes loving but often impossible to please. She had heard through the grapevine, probably from my brother David, that I was about to spend my life savings on a house of my own. She waited until a quiet Sunday afternoon to confront me. I remember her standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me with a mixture of disbelief and anger. She told me it was selfish of me to go off and build my own house when David and his wife, Jessica, were struggling. They wanted to buy a house too, but Jessica had lost her job, and David's salary barely covered their rent and bills. My mother insisted that I give my savings to Jessica, so she and David could finally have a place of their own. The conversation quickly turned into an argument. She said it was my duty as a daughter to help my family, that I was being greedy and ungrateful after everything she had done for me. I tried to explain how hard I had worked, how much I had sacrificed, but she wouldn't listen. She said that family comes first, that a real daughter would put her brother's happiness ahead of her own. Jessica called me that night, crying and begging me to help them. Even David, who usually stayed out of our mother's dramas, called to say he couldn't believe I was being so stubborn. I was torn. I loved my family, but I couldn't let go of my dream. I lay awake night after night, turning the situation over in my mind, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had worked too hard and waited too long to just hand over everything I had built. I knew that if I gave in now, I would regret it for the rest of my life. My dream house was more than just bricks and wood. It was proof that I could build a future for myself, no matter how hard things got. So, despite my mother's anger and Jessica's tears, I made my decision. I would keep my savings and build my house. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in my life, I felt ready to fight for what I wanted, no matter who tried to stop me. The day I told my mother no was one of the hardest days of my life. I expected anger, but nothing could have prepared me for the cold silence that followed. For weeks, Linda didn't speak to me, not even a single word at the dinner table. She slammed cupboard doors, muttered under her breath, and made sure I knew I was disappointing her at every turn. Jessica, my sister-in-law, tried a different approach. She sent long texts and left voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. She reminded me how hard things had been for her and David, how they had always helped me when I needed it, and how much it would mean for their little family to have a house of their own. The guilt pressed down on me, heavy as a stone. But every time I thought about giving in, I remembered those years of work, my aching feet from double shifts, the missed birthdays, the sacrifices I had made. If I gave away my savings now, it would all be for nothing. It was more than money. It was every hope I'd carried through a decade of hard days. So I did something I'd never done before. I stood my ground. I told my mother, as gently as I could, that I wouldn't be giving my savings to anyone. The fallout was swift and fierce. My brother David barely looked at me when we crossed paths in the hallway, and Jessica stopped inviting me to family dinners. The house felt colder and lonelier than ever, but somewhere deep inside, a little flame of courage kept burning. After weeks of searching, I found the perfect piece of land. It was just outside Columbus, far enough from the city to feel peaceful, but close enough that I could still drive to work in under 30 minutes. The land wasn't large, but it sat on the edge of a quiet road, surrounded by big maple trees and wildflowers. I stood in the middle of the lot one chilly morning in late spring, boots muddy and hair whipped by the wind, and felt something settle inside me. This was where I would build my dream. The first step was the hardest, signing over a huge chunk of my savings for the land itself. I felt sick as I wrote the check, my hand shaking, but once the deed was in my name, excitement took over. For the first time, this wasn't just a dream, it was real. I called builders and spent hours researching floor plans. I wanted something simple and strong, a place that would be easy to maintain and full of sunlight. I chose a 2-bedroom cottage with a wide porch and big windows, the kind of house I'd always imagined in my daydreams. Hiring a team felt like stepping into a whole new world. I was used to balancing budgets at work, but now I had to choose contractors, negotiate prices, and keep an eye on every detail. Some days it was overwhelming. My mother still refused to talk to me. Jessica once showed up at the site, tears in her eyes, and begged me to reconsider. She even tried to bring David along, but he stood awkwardly by the car, never meeting my gaze. I stood firm, though my heart hurt for them. I wanted everyone to be happy, but I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for everyone else. Building a house, I discovered, was equal parts frustration and joy. There were delays and arguments, wrong paint colors, and days when it felt like nothing was going right. But there were also moments of pure happiness, like watching the frame go up for the first time, walking through rooms that were still just studs and plywood, and seeing my ideas come to life. Every Friday evening, I would drive out to the site after work, climb the little hill at the back, and imagine the finished home. I pictured myself planting sunflowers along the porch, hanging wind chimes in the trees, and maybe finally inviting friends over for a barbecue. It became the heartbeat of my days. As the house took shape, I found new strength in myself. I learned how to read blueprints, talk to electricians, and make decisions quickly. The men on the crew, led by a kind contractor named Sam, began to respect me for my persistence and clear vision. They saw how much this meant to me, how hard I was willing to work to see it through. Even when problems popped up, like the time we found an old well hidden under the lot, or when a storm tore half the roof tarps away, I kept going. This wasn't just about four walls and a roof. It was about proving to myself and maybe to my family that I could stand on my own 2 feet. 6 months later, almost to the day, my house was finished. It wasn't a mansion, but it was everything I had dreamed of. Pale blue siding, a small but cheerful porch with room for a rocking chair, and big, bright windows that looked out onto the wild garden I planned to tame. Inside, the kitchen was warm and inviting, the living room cozy with a little fireplace, and 2 bedrooms waiting for future possibilities. I remember the feeling of the keys in my hand, a sense of relief and pride I'd never known before. I stood on the porch as the sun set, the sky streaked pink and gold, and I felt happier than I ever had in my life. This was mine. All of it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to walk from room to room, running my hands along the walls, opening and closing cupboards just because I could. Every little creak and groan was new and exciting. I imagined where I'd hang photos, where I'd put my grandmother's old chair, and how I'd fill the place with laughter and light. I finally drifted off to sleep as dawn was breaking, my dreams filled with plans for the garden and visions of quiet mornings spent with coffee on my porch. The next morning I woke up early, heart still pounding with happiness. I decided to treat myself to breakfast from my favorite little diner in town, a stack of pancakes, a celebration of everything I had achieved. As I locked the door behind me and stepped into the cool air, I glanced back at my house, pride swelling in my chest. I had done it. Against all odds, I had built the life I wanted, but when I returned an hour later, everything changed. A thick pillar of smoke was rising above the trees, dark and frightening. My heart dropped into my stomach. I broke into a run, keys jangling in my hand, terror clawing at my throat. As I rounded the final corner and my house came into view, flames were already leaping from the windows, devouring the home I had built from the ground up. Neighbors stood on their lawns, watching in helpless silence. The fire truck's siren wailed in the distance, but I knew in that terrible moment that nothing would ever be the same. The memory of that morning plays on a loop in my mind. The drive back from the diner was supposed to be peaceful, the sun shining through my windshield, a bag of warm pancakes beside me on the passenger seat. For the first few minutes, my thoughts drifted happily from room to room of my new house, picturing where I'd hang curtains and what flowers to plant beneath the windows. But as I turned onto my street, the world tilted on its axis. I saw a column of dark smoke curling into the blue sky, impossibly tall, horribly real. My foot slammed the brake, heart stuttering in my chest. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. As I pulled up to the house, I saw my neighbors standing on their lawns, hands covering their mouths. My beautiful house was engulfed in flames, the roof already collapsing in on itself. The sight was so surreal I felt detached, as if I were watching a scene from a disaster movie. Someone shouted my name, but it sounded far away, muffled by the roaring of the fire and the pounding of my own heart. I jumped out of the car and stumbled toward the blaze, heat hitting me like a physical force. All I could think was that I had to do something, anything, but there was nothing to be done. The fire was too big, too wild, devouring every dream I had poured into that house. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm and steady as she told me the fire trucks were on their way, but I could already see it was too late. Flames were pouring out of every window. The porch where I had stood just last night, imagining lazy Sunday mornings, was collapsing into charred rubble. My new furniture, my family photos, even the first little plants I bought for the garden all gone. I could barely breathe. My whole body shook as I sank onto the curb, staring at the devastation in front of me. My chest hurt with a grief I didn't have words for. The fire department arrived and rushed to contain what they could, but the damage was total. They kept people back and made sure everyone was safe, but I could see it in their faces. They knew there was nothing to salvage. The police arrived soon after, taking statements and moving through the crowd. I answered their questions numbly, telling them how I'd just moved in yesterday, how I'd only been gone an hour, how everything had seemed perfectly normal when I left. As the smoke settled and the last embers died down, I stood there, ruined and lost, trying to understand what had happened. At first, everyone assumed it was an accident. The firefighters speculated about faulty wiring or maybe a kitchen fire that got out of hand. But something inside me nagged, a cold suspicion that wouldn't let go. I was careful, always careful. There was no way I could have started a fire by mistake. And then, as the sun began to dip behind the ruined shell of my house, I remembered the cameras. A few months before, my friend Rachel had insisted I install a security system in the house. She worked in tech, always thinking 10 steps ahead of everyone else, and she'd helped me set up tiny, discreet cameras in every room and outside by the doors. At first, I'd felt silly, like I was being paranoid, but Rachel insisted, "You never know. It's good insurance just in case." She'd even set up the cloud account, making sure the footage uploaded automatically so nothing could be erased or tampered with. I thanked my neighbors for their kindness, ignored the pitying looks, and drove to Rachel's apartment, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could barely speak as I told her what happened, my voice raw from smoke and crying. She sat me down at her kitchen table, poured me a glass of water, and handed me my laptop. "Let's check the footage," she said softly. The footage loaded slowly, and every second felt like an eternity. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisted in knots, watching myself leave the house that morning, locking the door behind me, a bag of breakfast in hand, completely unaware. The timestamp ticked by, minute after minute, nothing unusual. And then at 9:27 a.m., the front door opened. It was my mother, Linda. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. I watched as she stepped inside, glancing over her shoulder like she was making sure no one was watching. In her hand, she held a red gas can. The sight was so shocking, so wrong, I almost thought I was dreaming, but there she was, unmistakable. My mother walked through every room, her face grim and determined, splashing gasoline across my new floors, my furniture, even the curtains I had just hung up the night before. She moved methodically, pausing only to wipe her hands or adjust her grip on the can. Then, with a single strike of a match, she set the fire, watching for a moment as the flames leapt to life. She left through the back door, not looking back once. The recording ended, but I kept staring at the screen, unable to move. My mother. My heart pounded in my ears. I felt betrayed, gutted, like my whole world had been set on fire along with my house. Rachel watched me with wide, horrified eyes. "You need to call the police," she whispered. "You need to show them this right now." We made a copy of the footage and backed it up, just in case. I sent it to the secret cloud account Rachel had set up and made sure it was safe. Then sat for a long time in Rachel's living room, the video playing over and over in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Linda's face cold, angry, determined. The realization hit me all over again. It wasn't just the house she'd destroyed. She had destroyed the trust, the bond, the love I'd spent my whole life trying to keep alive. The next morning, I'd posted the video online. I didn't know what else to do. I was angry and broken and needed people to see what had happened. I wanted them to know the truth, to see that this wasn't an accident or a simple tragedy. My mother had made a choice, a terrible choice, and I wasn't going to hide it. The video spread quickly, picked up by people across social media, shared and commented on by thousands. Some people were horrified, some were angry, and a few even tried to blame me. But most people offered support and encouragement, sending messages of sympathy and outrage. That afternoon, I went to the police with Rachel by my side. I showed them the footage, handed over the backup files, and told them everything I knew. The officers watched the video in silence, their faces growing hard. They told me they would investigate immediately. I felt numb, empty, as I signed statements and answered their questions. I drove home to what was left of my house and stood outside the burned skeleton of my dream. The loss was unbearable, but I knew I had to keep moving. I knew I had to fight for justice, not just for myself, but for every dreamer who'd ever been told no. I had lost almost everything, but not my courage, and not the truth. I barely slept the night after taking the video to the police. Every time I closed my eyes, my mother's face flashed before me, her jaw set, her eyes narrowed with the anger I had known my whole life but never thought would burn so literally. I lay awake in Rachel's spare bedroom, listening to the city's distant sounds and feeling every ache in my bones. I tried to remind myself to breathe, to let go, to trust that things would somehow work out, but it was hard to feel hope when the ashes of my dreams were still so fresh. But then the world took over. The video I had uploaded, the proof of what Linda had done, spread like wildfire across social media. I didn't realize just how quickly things could move until my phone started buzzing nonstop with notifications, messages, and friend requests from people I'd never met. At first, I was overwhelmed. Strangers offered their sympathy and their outrage. They called me brave. They called my mother a monster. Some even offered me money or places to stay. The kindness of strangers felt strange, almost unreal, but it was also comforting, like 1,000 hands reaching out to steady me when my own family had let me fall. By morning, the news had picked up the story. Local reporters called, wanting interviews. News vans rolled past the skeleton of my old house, their cameras trying to capture the ruins and the pain. It was surreal, watching my private heartbreak become a public spectacle. At times, I wanted to hide, to run away and erase the whole mess. But Rachel reminded me that this story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to anyone who'd ever been betrayed or bullied, anyone who'd lost something to someone they loved. So I spoke. I told my story honestly, not just for myself, but for all the silent people watching from the sidelines. The police moved quickly. They arrested my mother at her house. I didn't go to watch, but I heard about it from David, who called me that afternoon. He was crying, his voice trembling as he asked me, "Why? Why did she do it?" For once, I didn't have an answer. I told him everything I could, but some wounds run too deep for words. My mother was charged with arson and destruction of property, and the district attorney decided to prosecute. The evidence was overwhelming: the video, the empty gas cans found in her trunk, and the way she had tried to act innocent when questioned. The trial was quick, almost painfully so. I sat in the courtroom, heart pounding, as the verdict came down, guilty on all counts. It wasn't the ending I had ever wanted for my family. I had always dreamed of us sitting together in my new kitchen, laughing and sharing stories, finding our way back to each other. But as I watched my mother led away in handcuffs, I understood that sometimes justice is the only way forward, even when it's wrapped in grief and regret. The insurance company had seen the video too. At first, they hesitated, sending investigators and asking endless questions. But the evidence was undeniable. I had paid my premiums on time, I had followed all the rules, and the fire was no accident. Within a few weeks, I received a letter confirming that the full amount would be paid out, $140,000. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place, but it felt bittersweet, almost heavy in my hands. No amount of money could ever replace the feeling I'd had on the night I moved into my first house. The sense of finally having a home. But life moves forward, even when you feel stuck in place. I started looking for a new lot, determined not to let the fire or my mother's betrayal define me. This time, I chose a spot a few miles farther out, near a small lake surrounded by tall trees and wildflowers. I hired Sam again, the contractor who had built my first house, and told him I wanted the same floor plan, but with a few upgrades. I wanted stronger windows, a reinforced roof, and a better security system. Sam agreed, and we got to work. During the weeks of construction, I found myself driving to the site almost every evening, watching the walls go up, the roof take shape, the windows slide into place. I was nervous, of course, but also determined. Each nail hammered, each board placed, felt like another piece of my heart being rebuilt. I planted sunflowers again, just like I had planned for the first house, and I bought a new rocking chair for the porch. I even painted the front door a bright, hopeful yellow, a color I'd never dared to choose before. The support I received from people all over America helped me more than I expected. Letters arrived every day, some from people in Ohio, others from places as far away as California or Texas. They shared their own stories of heartbreak and starting over, a family gone wrong and dreams rebuilt from ashes. I realized I wasn't alone. My pain was mine, but it was also shared, and that made it just a little easier to bear. Meanwhile, the fallout in my family was bigger than I could have imagined. David, for the first time in his life, saw Linda. When Jessica tried to defend my mother, insisting she'd just been desperate, that family sometimes does crazy things. David couldn't take it anymore. I'll never forget the call I got from him, his voice tired and sad. "I'm filing for divorce," he said. "I can't be married to someone who thinks that's okay. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." I wished I could comfort him, but I knew he needed to find his way through the wreckage. As for my mother, she was sentenced to several years in prison. I visited her once, hoping for closure, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. She blamed me, even then. "You could have just given the money to Jessica," she said, her voice cold and flat. "You broke this family." I left feeling hollow but also certain I had made the right choice. Some people can't be reached, no matter how much you wish they could. When the new house was finally finished, I stood on the porch as the sun set. The sky streaked with orange and lavender, and let myself breathe. I felt stronger. I had survived loss, betrayal, and the hardest choice I'd ever made. This time, my house was more than just a shelter. It was proof that I could survive anything. I hung a sign by the door, "Home is where you build it." And for the first time, I believed it. I promised myself, standing there on my porch, that I would never let anyone steal my future again. No matter how fierce the storm, I would hold tight to my dreams. And maybe, just maybe, I could inspire someone else to do the same.